got my first manual grinder in 2015, so now that's 10 years ago. And since that time, I've had probably around 50 different manual grinders come through this testing station. And I gotta say, the market today is completely unrecognizable compared to back then. Back then, you had maybe 3 good options, whereas today it's quite overwhelming, but also pretty amazing, because what you're looking at here isn't just the best manual grinders you can buy right now. This also represents the kind of evolution among manual grinders. So this lineup can also explain how grinders have kind of changed over the last 10 years, how we have improvements in burr geometry and in design and overall user experience. And a very important thing to keep in mind is that some of the classics here, grinders that people still recommend to this day, they built their reputation back in something like 2016 to 2018. And honestly, I think they are kind of coasting now. The innovation has moved on, so today you can actually get grinders under $100 that outperforms what $250 bought you 7 years ago. I'll of course tell it like I see it in this roundup. But to do things a little bit differently today, I'm going to give you the big headlines first, so my top choices among the grinders, and then we'll dive into the details with each one. And of course there will also be chapters down below. So if you are especially interested in any certain model, then you can just click down there and then jump directly. Oh, and before we go further, I should put a caveat here and say that the focus for today is just grinders under or around $300, because I do think that's the range where it makes sense to go for a manual grinder. So while something like the Comandante C40 and the Pietro, they're great grinders, I think when you get up to that price point, it just makes more sense to start looking to electric grinders with flat burrs instead. So first up, many people, they will get a manual grinder for travel reasons, and my top pick here is the Espresso Q Air. It's tiny, it's affordable, it's built like a tank actually, and it tastes suspiciously close to a grinder that costs 3 to 4 times as much. And we'll dive more into that later. When it comes to the ultimate bang for your buck grinder, around $100, my choice is this one here, the R3 Blade from MHW Bomber. It's built like a tank, and then this is something I haven't seen people talk about elsewhere, is that it can actually be upgraded with another burr set that can completely change the taste. Now, when it comes to the light roast specialist, then I have to pick this one here, the Phantox Pro. It's a really good grinder for modern espresso and filter coffee, and it hits that Goldilocks zone of advanced yet approachable, but it does have one big problem you should keep in mind, and we'll get into that later. For me, if I had to pick the best all-rounder among all these grinders on the table, the one that combines the best experience for pour over, for espresso, the best user experience, then it's going to be the Espresso K Ultra here. It's just good at everything. Everything you throw at it will work, and it's really nice to use. If you want a luxury option where you trade some usability for some nice touches, then that's the Millab M01. It's a premium feeling, excellent results, but it has also taught me something about extraction, something that breaks the rules. And we need to talk about that a little bit later. When it comes to traditional espresso, then J Ultra is my top pick. Great flavor, great user experience all around. And I think it's actually a little bit underrated for pour over. So those are just my preferences, and you might disagree with them. I'm sure some people will, but I'll talk more about the differences about each individual grinder at the end of the video, so you can make up your own mind. So the first thing I want to discuss is the evolution of manual grinders and how come they look the way today. And I would say there is definitely an evolution. And if you look at something like the Comandante grinder, you could see that most grinders today, they kind of follow this shape here, this barrel shape, and then you have a slightly bent handle. You have an axle that's stabilized with ball bearings, and this design is just very hard to improve upon. And that's because it just works. If we go back many years to these old school grinders, they were kind of big boxes, and then they had a handle, and you were supposed to stabilize them on the table. And there's a good reason we don't really see this old mill design today, and that's because it just doesn't work that great. So over the years, we have seen brands that have tried to do things differently, perhaps placing the handle so you twist this way and then you have some gears inside to reduce the tension. We have also seen completely different designs, like very long bodies with short handles. For example, that's what the Lido 3 from Orphan Espresso uses. But in my opinion, that design is a little bit unwieldy, difficult to control, and also difficult to adjust. So you could also argue that a grinder such as the Pietro tries to change things, and I personally also find that it's quite uncomfortable to use. The problem is that when you try to change this design, the user experience, ease of use, grinding speed, they all tend to deteriorate. So that's the reason why 98% of all manual grinders, they follow this formula. Now, when it comes to the flavor profile of the grinders, I think there's often a lot of talk about one grinder being better than the other, and people attempt to kind of make this hierarchy and say, oh, this one is better than that one, and this one is 5% cleaner. But I think there's actually a better way to think about grinder differences. Instead, I prefer to think of grinders as having certain qualities rather than trying to rank them very methodically. And here I use a mental model based on an old concept from anthropology and psychology, and that is called the Bouba and Kiki framework. So Bouba and Kiki are two very different shapes and also two very different sounds. So intuitively, we understand that Kiki is sharp and dynamic, while Bouba is more balanced, more static, more rounded. So while this concept comes from a different world, I think it applies very well to food and taste, and it also applies to grinders and burr sets. So for instance, the Espresso K Ultra and the Comandante C40, they are very similar in cup profile, but I will just say that the K Ultra is a little bit more Kiki than C40. It's a little bit more balanced, a bit more Bouba. Then we have the Espresso Q Air, and it also has this heptagonal burr set. And remember in the introduction, I said that it tastes suspiciously much like a more expensive grinder, and that grinder is actually the Comandante C40. And in some blind tests, I couldn't tell them apart, and that's because they're both a little bit more Bouba than the K Ultra. So while I think the K Ultra and the C40 might be a touch more enjoyable in the cup compared to the Q Air, I would still say if you want something in the Espresso lineup that tastes more like a Comandante, then the Q Air would be the best candidate because it has that similar profile in terms of being rounded and how it presents acidity. And when you look at the burr design, this hexagonal burr that is actually used in many of the grinders, when you look at the flavor profile, and if you want to place them on this Kiki scale, they are actually all clustered in the same area, and the differences between them are there, but they're kind of small. So if we contrast to something like the Millab M01, I will put it more towards the middle, more balanced, more static, and more analytical compared to the C40 and K Ultra. Of course, there are grinders that are better than others. Like, let's say if we take the Timemore C5 and compare it to the C3, then I think the C5 is better. But these leagues are kind of overlapping to a certain extent and will also be subject to personal preferences. So if I were to rank the grinders across different categories, this is how I do it. When it comes to pour over, many of the heptagonal grinders tend to do the best, as well as the ZB6 and M1. When it comes to traditional espresso, we see a different burr type, a different burr set that is doing better, while the heptagonals, they still perform well enough. They are a little bit more thin-bodied, but these two tend to have more of that oomph in the cup. And when it comes to modern espresso, I would say it's only really the Millab M01 and the Mavo Phantox Pro that I would really say are great. And that's because modern espresso, generally something with flat burrs, tend to do a lot better. So now let's talk about the grinders one by one. So this is the Kinu M47 Phoenix, and this is a little bit of a weird case for me to describe. I'm not quite sure what to think of it. For espresso, it tastes really good, as I mentioned, one of my favorites for traditional textured shots. So if you like that classic rich espresso, then this is a really good grinder. For pour over, it's also quite decent, although it's a bit more blended compared to all the heptagonal grinders on the table that tend to have more of that sharpness. And this particular Phoenix model here is actually the cheapest Kinu grinder, but still it's one of the most expensive ones here on the table. And the Phoenix model has plastic internals, whereas the more expensive versions, they come with steel inside, and that makes them heavier and more expensive. So my main gripe with the Phoenix is this plastic catch cup here. It feels flimsy and cheaply made, and it's not very well designed. And when you look online, you'll also see many reports of it breaking because the plastic is kind of thin, and it also tends to be quite hard to get a replacement. For example, if you look at Kinu's online shop now in the United States, this plastic catch cup is sold out, but you can currently get an aluminum catch cup on their website for $29. But I think that catch cup should probably just be standard in the Phoenix, because this grinder is $250 at the standard price. But when most of these grinders here can do it at cheaper prices, then I think it would also be fair enough to expect from this grinder. But besides that, the design just isn't great because it's black, so it's hard to see if you have any leftover grounds there. And then on the inside, there's this kind of annoying indentation. There's an edge. So when you turn it around to pour out your espresso grounds, it tends to catch some of them. And then because it's black, you don't really notice that you're missing some of your doughs. One unique thing about the Kinu grinder is that it's the only grinder with a handle that is kind of affixed to the body. And actually I like that, but it also means that it has to use this different adjustment system. And that's a system I'm not 100% into. I find it's quite tricky to switch between pour over and espresso. And also dialing in for espresso is kind of finicky compared to something like the J Ultra, where you have clicks to go by. That makes it more easy to go back and forth between your settings. It's not the fastest grinder out there. An 18 gram dose takes about 50 seconds, while the J Ultra does it in 40 seconds. But it still feels good in the hand when you operate it. And also, if you get tired of using it for espresso, then they do have that burr that is called the Kinu Poro burr, and you can swap that in, and then you kind of have a different grinder, different grinding experience, and it's also a very nice one. So the Kinu is definitely a solid choice, but it feels a little bit expensive for the amount of plastic that you're getting, and the user experience is just, I don't think it's quite up there with the best of them, even though it's quite good. And now we might as well talk about the J Ultra right away, which is kind of the rival to Kinu. And it just offers a really good user experience, very similar to the K Ultra in many ways. And since the K Ultra, for me, it's the best grinder when it comes to workflow, the J Ultra by default is also up in that league. The flavor profile for espresso is really good, nice textured shots, but still with a decent amount of clarity. For pour over, it's not the best, but it's actually not that bad. I think I was previously a little bit hard on it on some occasions, but I've since realized that it needs to be dialed in a little bit finer than you might think. So if the grinds are too coarse, then the pour over is going to taste quite watery, but you can actually go pretty fine without getting too much bitterness, so it's worth experimenting with. I'm not completely sure whether I prefer the Kinu or the J Ultra for pour over, but switching between brew methods is definitely way easier on the J Ultra. I have a long video where I talk more about the J Ultra, so I'll put that down below. The K Ultra is, in my opinion, the best all-round grinder. The workflow and user experience are just excellent. I love it for pour over, and it also does a solid job with espresso. The body tends to be a bit thinner compared to the J Ultra, but the shots are still quite enjoyable. I tend to like it for slightly longer shots as well. Is it the absolute best for pour over? Well, maybe not in terms of clarity. If we take something like the ZB6 and the M1, they might edge it out a little bit for some ultralight roast where you're trying to pick out some florals or something like that. But for most people, the K Ultra is going to be very impressive and very satisfying. So if you want a grinder that just handles everything quite well, this is the one. Compared to the J Ultra, it's a little bit easier to switch between espresso and pour over because you can do it all on one rotation, whereas on the J Ultra, you have to go a couple of rotations to go back and forth. So that gives you smaller steps for espresso, which is better, but a bit more of a hassle for daily use. So that's better on the K Ultra. If I could get one thing that I would like to see slightly improved in the future, then that would be this kind of textured grip zone here. This material is made of this kind of faux leather, and it can get a little bit beat up and bruised if you're traveling with it and you don't put it in a special carry case. So it would be nice to see something like the Mavo Phantox or the Chestnut C5, a kind of textured pattern here. That would feel a little bit more premium. So the ZB6, I've talked a lot about it in other videos, so I'll link to those down below. It's a very analytical grinder, excellent clarity, especially for light roast pour. If you're not focused on body and texture, and you mainly drink those washed floral coffees, it's probably the best grinder in the lineup. But if you're into medium roasts or funkier beans, then other grinders such as the K Ultra, Timemore S3, Comandante, I think they're just more versatile. The ZB6 is very specialized, and of course it's top tier in that niche, but it's not the best grinder for the majority of people. I recommend it as a second or third grinder when you already have some experience with specialty coffee and you're ready to take that next step. Oh, and of course it also doesn't work for espresso. The Millab M01 is a super solid grinder in terms of design and build quality. The materials, the looks, I would say probably the best on the table. It feels really nice in the hand, but it's also quite large and heavy, over 1 kilo. So it's not the best in terms of comfort or portability. I'd rather travel with pretty much all of the other grinders here. As for flavor, I think it's very enjoyable. I released a review a while ago, and even though I thought I was quite positive, some people said to me that I was being too tough on it and underrating it. And actually, a few people got in touch with me and said, hey, you're using it completely wrong. You have to try it at this ultra coarse setting, and then it's just completely different, really outstanding. So let's say I'm brewing with it and I'm at setting 8. My drawdown is already quite fast, and I have an extraction yield of 18%. So what's going to happen if I go to setting 10, so the coarsest setting, or even beyond that, because you can actually go even coarser by opening it up down here at the bottom, and that's what one of my online coffee friends said. You need to open it up to 4 or 5 and then just brew at this ultra coarse level. So I tried that, and it's true, I actually got some really interesting cups, but the problem is just that when you go this coarse, then it means that your strength is also going to drop down. So maybe you have a TDS of around 0.90 or something like that. So to compensate for that, that means that you'll have to use even more coffee. So you're adjusting the ratio. Now maybe you go down to something like 1 to 14, 1 to 15 to get a decent amount of TDS in the cup. And by decent, that just means something like 1.15 to 1.20. But when you do all these things, that also means that the extraction yield is going to drop significantly. So you're going to be brewing at 15 to 16% extraction yield, which is quite low. So typically we value grinders that can go higher without losing clarity. So it feels a little bit strange to praise a grinder for tasting great at super low extractions. So it's true, when you get down to that 15% extraction yield, you do get some of that kind of glass-like transparency that you would normally get with some SSP burr sets, but they can do it at 18, 19, 20% extraction. So I feel like it's not quite an apple-to-apple comparison here. But the M1 is a little bit of a strange case because it seems to have different kind of distinct sweet spots. So for example, it tastes good at low extractions, but then you can also push it to really high extractions, and then suddenly it will taste better than something like the K Ultra as well, indicating a more consistent particle size. But then if we're talking about a more normal range, say 18 to 20% extraction, which is where most recipes are designed to perform well, that's probably where the M1 is the most generic, and that's also the area where I compared it to the ZB6 in my initial review and found that it had less clarity. But of course, clarity isn't everything when it comes to coffee, so you might still like it more than the ZB6. If I had to put the M1 on the Bouba Kiki scale, I would say it's more towards the center, maybe a little bit closer to the Bouba side. The acidity is not especially sharp, and it's not an especially sweet grinder, but it's just good at focusing in on the main flavor notes and present them quite neutral without a lot of coloring, and kind of holding them up in front of you for a long time. So if you have some really nice fruity coffees, then you can get that very transparent presentation of those. Another thing about the M1 is that it's actually a really solid performer for modern espresso. So for light roast, lungos, allongés, soup, all these kind of things. And I think alongside the Phantox Pro, definitely the two best grinders in this lineup. The price is still a little bit of an unknown here, so it's been on a pre-order sale with 25% off for quite a long time, but I think those days might soon be over, and then it's going to retail around $350 US. But if you can still get that discount, then it's similarly priced to the K Ultra, and at that price level, it's kind of hard to decide which one to go for. The Mavo Phantox Pro strikes a really nice balance. It's got external adjustments, grinds quickly, it's not too heavy, feels good in the hand, and it also has this very unique design. And it's especially good for light roasts, both pour over and espresso. As mentioned, alongside the M1, this is my top choice for modern espresso. The other heptagonal grinders, they can also make some decent modern shots, but not quite as well as the Phantox Pro. The flip side is that it's really bad for traditional espresso. The shots are just kind of fluffy, airy, very thin body, so definitely don't use it for that. The adjustment is external, and you have a quite good range both for espresso and pour over, but still you can do it all on one rotation. So each click is 16.6 microns. So that gives you a pretty good dialing in range. It also has a burr set that is following this heptagonal style to some degree, but overall it is a different design. It's not quite as sharp or acidity forward as some of the other ones. So I will put it on the Kiki side, but closer to the middle, perhaps even a little bit closer than the Comandante and the Q Air. So when I add it all up and consider the price, the user experience, the design, I think it's unique enough not to be boring. It still feels quite premium, and it's nice to use on a daily basis. So if you're a modern coffee geek and you want to do light roast espresso, light roast filter coffee, and you don't quite have the budget for something like the M1, or you don't want something as big, then I think the Mavo Phantox Pro is a really cool grinder. The R3 Blade grinder from MHW Bomber is one of the cheapest grinders on the table, but you wouldn't really know that because it's kind of like has the whole flagship experience. So this grinder has an external adjustment system that works really well. Then you have a magnetic catch cut, and it's actually a really nice one with a bunch of magnets and then this really long lip here. And that ensures that you're not going to knock it off by accident. It also comes with something that's completely different than all the other grinders, and that is that it has this built-in system for sieves. So you have 5 different sieves, and then you can sift out the fines. And I found the results are quite interesting, but also a little bit faffy and not super repeatable. So once you start removing fines from a grind distribution, everything kind of changes a little bit. Maybe you need to grind finer to compensate for that. You have to change your style. So I use so many different grinders on a daily basis, so it's difficult for me to really get into. But if you only have a couple of grinders, then I could actually see it being something pretty cool. Flavor-wise, the burr set leans towards a slightly blended profile. So if you enjoy medium roasts, you value sweetness, I would say it performs quite well for pour over, AeroPress, these things. For espresso, it's more suited towards darker roasts, in my opinion. It's not as refined as something like the Kinu or J Ultra, and there's sometimes a little bit of astringency as well. But for the price and build quality, it's a really solid choice. Now, as I alluded to in the intro, there's actually one thing you can do that completely changes your experience with this grinder. And I haven't really even seen anyone mention this online, but it's extremely easy to remove the inner cone burr. And then you can actually swap it out for other burrs of the same size. And so far, I've tested it with the Kinu pour over burr and also an old 48mm espresso burr from Mill. That's quite similar to the one used in the Kinu and the J Ultra, and the results have been really, really impressive. So the cool thing is that for espresso, the grinding speed drops a lot from around 1 minute and 50 seconds to grind a shot to just 40 seconds for a 16-gram dose. It does require more torque when you're grinding, so you might want to add a rubber band or something like that to make sure you really have a solid grip, because otherwise it can be a little bit slippery. But the results in the cup have been very enjoyable. both for pour over and for espresso. So if you're curious about this burr upgrade, then let me know in the comments, and maybe I'll make something more about it. I'm still experimenting, it's still early days for me, but it seems like this can really improve the blade. And if it was already a compelling grinder before, then it's just even better now. Now let's talk about the Timemore C2 and the C3. Here I have the C3, but this will also make it as a stand-in for C2 because they are identical on the outside. The only real difference is the burr set. And the Timemore C2 was actually one of my old favorite budget grinders. So the form factor is really practical. It's compact enough. You can bring it on a trip. Still big enough, you could use it at home daily if you want to. It holds around 25 grams, which I think is a pretty good size for a day-to-day grinder. But one thing that really stood out about the C2 was the grinding speed for pour over. It was just super fast. You could easily grind between 0.7 to 1 grams per second, which is pretty outstanding at this price point. When it came out around 5-6 years ago, the grinder market was way less crowded than it is today, and the C2 stood out as one of the most compelling cheap options available. It couldn't really grind for espresso though, so that's why Timemore upgraded it with this C3 model here. And the only really change to that grinder is the burr set. The rest of the design is identical. The C3 can grind fine enough for espresso, but dialing it in is a bit frustrating on the standard model. So each click will move your shot time around 15 seconds. So you're basically limited to just finding one usable espresso setting for your individual machine setup. And then you have to dial it in with adjusting dose or tamping harder or softer and small things like that. On top of that, the C3 is noticeably slower than the C2. So if you're mostly brewing filter coffee and you don't need the espresso capabilities, I actually think C2 is nicer for everyday use. In terms of cup quality, they're kind of on a similar level. The results are different, but whether you prefer one over the other comes down to taste. So both works best with medium to dark roasts. If you're into lighter roasts, I wouldn't recommend either. If you want something cheap that's much better, then I would go for the Q-Air instead. C5 is the new and upgraded version from the C3. There's no C4, and that's because that number is considered to be unlucky in China, so they just jumped straight to C5 instead. And it's a pretty clear upgrade. It has better build quality. It also has a different new burr design, slightly larger burr set, and I do think it tastes better than both C2 and C3. It can also grind for espresso. The shots are good. The only downside is that it's very slow to grind for espresso, so it takes around 2 minutes to grind for an 18-gram shot. It's also a bit more expensive than the C2 and C3. Still, I will say the C5, it has a really nice build, and from a pure kind of aesthetical point of view, I think it might just be one of the nicest grinders here. Now, this one is S3, so this is the bigger brother compared to the chestnut C5, and you can also feel that when you have it in the hand, it feels even more heavy, and it also looks a little bit more refined. Now it's actually the mid-ranger in Timemore's lineup, because technically Millab is also made by Timemore, but regardless of that, I do still think that it feels very much like a premium product when you have it in the hand. Like the build quality is as good or better than any of the grinders here on the table. It also has this super snappy handle, which I really like. And this is something Timemore does really well. And the cool thing about this is that it also makes the grinder more stable when it's standing. It's less likely to fold. When you're traveling with it, you can also kind of like store it as one unit, like so. When it comes to the flavor profile, I would say really nice, sweet cups, but you still have some complexity. So if I had to put this on the Bouba Kiki spectrum, I would say it leans quite Bouba. So it's really great at pulling out these more plum-like notes, apricot, rather than the citric flavor notes. And for some coffees, for example, like naturals and anaerobics, I think it does a really good job. For me, the big downside of the Timemore S3 is that it can't grind fine enough for espresso. So you can go almost all the way quite fine, but you can't quite generate 9 bars of pressure with a regular 58mm portafilter. But if you want a grinder at that mid-range price point, that's really nice to use, grinds fast, produces nice sweet cups, then this is a really good bet. The Kingrinder K6 is a very popular budget grinder. It gives you pretty much similar burrs to the K Ultra at a much cheaper price point. I'm saying pretty much similar because even though on the surface they look a lot alike, with burrs even the smallest tweaks can result in quite different flavor profiles. And I do think it tastes different from the K Ultra as well. It's a little bit more full-bodied, a little bit less clarity compared to the K Ultra, but still very good. But of course it does come with a few compromises compared to the K Ultra. So first of all, instead of a magnetic catch cup, you have this screw-on catch cup here. The handle, since I got mine on AliExpress, they still have this bend handle here. But if you buy it elsewhere in the world, it will come with a straight handle, which ergonomically is less nice to use. But overall, even this handle, I think it feels a little bit cheap. You have to install this plastic disc yourself. So overall, it does feel a little bit like a budget Espresso grinder. And that's kind of like the general feeling with all of Kingrinder's models. So for instance, they also have a version of the Q Air called the P2, and that one is also noticeably more flimsy in terms of construction, has worse bearings. Another downside with the K6 is that this assembly process is much more complicated compared to the K Ultra, and you have this little paper clip in here that you have to position perfectly to hold the axle in place, and that little clip is actually responsible for holding the whole axle fixed into the body. Another thing to be aware of with the K6 is that you sometimes hear about users who have problems with bearings developing rust in the grinder. So I wouldn't recommend using RDT with the grinder because it seems a little bit risky. So I think since this grinder is so cheap, they have to cut corners somewhere, and that might be with the bearings. So, and that would be a little bit the same as with the P2. I also think it has bearings that are lower quality compared to the Q Air. In terms of flavor, I would say it sits as expected somewhere between the K Ultra and the Q Air, also similar to the Comandante. So it's very solid for pour over, good for light roasts, also good for espresso. So objectively speaking, for the price, I think it delivers a lot of value for the money, probably some of the best value on the table here. But personally, I just don't get that excited about it because it has that budget knockoff feeling. The Q Air is great as a travel grinder, but it's also good enough to use every day if you are looking for a compact grinder. Let's say you have small hands, you want something that's really easy to hold. It's also compact. Then the Q Air could actually easily be that daily grinder. So the flavor profile, as I alluded to in the beginning, is actually quite similar to an expensive grinder, and that's the Comandante C40. So in blind tests leading up to this video, I was actually shocked when I was doing these tests how similar the Q Air and the Comandante C40 taste. So on that Bouba Kiki scale, I would place them exactly in the same spot. That doesn't mean that you can automatically say that it is as good as the C40, but personally I just wouldn't be confident that I would be able to tell them apart in blind taste tests. As a travel grinder, I really like the Q Air. It's just super lightweight, so you can bring it in even if you're just traveling with carry-on. And compared to all the other grinders here, because it has this very cheap and cheerful design, I wouldn't worry about throwing it into a bag. If it gets scratched, it's not a big deal compared to if you had some of these really nice grinders here. I've written a long blog post about it, so I'll link it down below if you're more curious. The Comandante C40 is a classic, and for a good reason. It delivers a very balanced, pleasant cup. It has that heptagonal burr profile, but it's also a little bit more relaxed and less acidity forward than some of the newer grinders here. For example, the K Ultra. And many people actually like this profile. So I find in taste tests, they're super similar, but there's just a little bit more fruit, a little bit more citric acid with the K Ultra compared to the Comandante C40. In terms of user experience, it feels a little bit dated, if we're honest. The adjustment is underneath the burrs, so you have to count click. On the plus side, because this grinder is so widespread and popular, there are a lot of recipes that reference those clicks, so that can be helpful. But compared to grinders with external adjustment, it's just less convenient. Compared to many other grinders, it's also kind of like more wide and beefy to hold, so if you have small hands, it's not quite ideal. It also works for espresso, although it's a little bit slow when it comes to grinding for espresso, and it doesn't have great granularity between steps unless you get an upgrade called the Red Clicks mod. So overall, it's just quite solid all across the board, but it's not really a top performer anymore. Another thing I don't love is how Comandante seems more focused on slowing down competitors rather than innovating. There's been a lot of talk about them trying to patent this handle shape here, which just sounds a little bit bizarre to me. I feel like it's quite a natural shape and it would be common in many different industries. So it just seems a little bit like the company's priorities aren't where they should be. Still, if I put all my personal opinions and feelings aside, I can understand why one would still get the C40 even in 2025. And it's for the same reason that people still buy Levi's 501s or Converse All-Stars and all these other classic things. So while there are technically superior options on the market, well, actually there are a lot of them, it's just nice to have something that you know performs well, that there's a big customer base that you can talk to, and if you have any problems, then probably they have experienced the same thing. And also, since it's a German brand, you know you should have pretty good customer service if you have any problems. The last grinder to talk about is the X Ultra, and this is kind of Espresso's mid-ranger. So if you want something between the Q Air and the K Ultra, then this will offer a very similar flavor experience. In terms of UX, also quite good. It has the external adjustment system, and it also has a magnetic catch cup. Personally, I think this magnetic catch cup design is not the best because it's kind of easy to push off by accident. So since the body is shaped the same way and it's quite short, it's very easy to end up having part of your hand resting against the catch cup here. So I'm always a little bit nervous when I'm using it. Still, it performs quite well for both pour over and espresso. And if you like the size and this is the price point you're shopping at, it's hard to say that you absolutely must choose the Phantox, the Timemore S3 or the K6 over this, because I think for the right person, it's a really good grinder. I was a little bit disappointed when I reviewed it first because I compared it to its predecessor, the X Pro, which it replaced. And compared to that grinder, the flavor profile is a little bit less enjoyable. So even though it was a little bit of a step back here, it's still a very good performer. So that was a lot of coffee grinders to talk about, and I hope that I've given you some good ideas when it comes to shopping for coffee grinders in 2025 and hopefully also in 2026, because I don't want to do this very soon again. So as mentioned, all these grinders are really solid, so pretty much no matter what you're going for, you're going to get a good experience, nice coffee in the cup. Of course, if you have experiences with any of these grinders, you're also very welcome to drop any comments down below. And don't forget that I have individual reviews of most, if not all, these grinders, so I'll link to them down below in the description box, so make sure to check that out as well. So that's it for today. I will see you in another coffee video very soon.